Welcome to Factory Forward, the podcast dedicated to advancing manufacturing and propelling factories into the future. Today, we are thrilled to have Kelly Mallery with us. In this episode, Kelly and Zishan discusses the key principles and practices of lean manufacturing, emphasizing the importance of human-centered approaches and continuous improvement. She also explores the impact of COVID-19 on lean practices and the role of emerging technologies like AI in shaping the future of manufacturing. Now, meet your host, Zishan Zia.
Hi everyone. Kelly Mallery is an operational excellence leader and lead coach. She has spent more than a decade working at lean manufacturing organizations, including GE Aerospace and Hypertherm, most recently as a business unit leader. Kelly holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in mechanical and control engineering from Dartmouth. Kelly, hi, thank you so much for being here. Really
Hi, John.
appreciate your time.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for the kind invitation.
Kelly, we'll jump right in. Could you share a personal story where kata principles resolved a conflict? I know you, I know you talk a lot about kata and those kinds of principles as they apply to industrial and manufacturing engineering. Would love to hear, you know, their application in conflict resolution.
Oh, yes. So I can share the very first focused learning group that I was a part of, where I was a kata learner, was focused on relationships with my family. And so it was a kind of a new area to explore the improvement kata inside of. And my coach even said, we haven't done this before, but let's try it and let's see what happens. Um, so I guess for those of you who don't know, I'll do a quick, what is the improvement kata? So this is research that Mike Rother did in the early 2000s at Toyota. So he was a student of Jeff Liker in Michigan, and his research was out to answer a couple of questions. One, what are those unseen managerial routines that lead Toyota to be what they are, right? We have all the tools that have come out, but what is under the surface? And then the second question was, how do we take that and distill it into patterns that then other organizations can then use? Because I think we've seen over the last 20 plus years of practice of lean from Toyota's perspective is we can't just copy and paste the tools. We're finding that doesn't quite work. So what else needs to be there? So the improvement kata is this pattern that you practice to learn and improve your scientific thinking ability and skills. So I was a learner for the very first time 4 years ago. And my challenge that I worked on was improving the relationships that I had with my family, which include my husband and two stepdaughters who are teenagers. So that's a fun place to come into. And so we did not have a lot of external conflict, but it did manifest. And I can say what happened here was my wonderful, beautiful stepdaughters were just being kids, and me coming into this relationship, right? It was brand new to me. I had not been familiar with, how to create the home and space for them, right? I'm not an only child, but I have not lived in an environment where I had children around as much. So what came of this was I noticed that I was being very hard on them and very, controlling of their behavior and the space while they were around. So I decided I wanted to change that. And I worked through the improvement kata on a challenge to help myself become better for my family there. And I will say, right, some of the principles of kata are that it's a never-ending learning journey. We never really know what's going to happen. So we have to experiment. And I did a lot of experimenting around how I approach conversations with them and how I come in and react. And through that, I learned a lot about myself coming into conflict and what can happen when you come in with vulnerability and humility and an open mind to learning about it as you go. So all of those principles 100% line up with conflict resolution, because we come in with this bias and expectations about how the other person is thinking and why they're acting the way they are, but we really don't know. And that's the beauty about practicing scientific thinking, is you learn to understand that you're jumping to a conclusion, and the only way to find out is to go ask.
Oh, I love that. That's really deep and insightful. Appreciate it. Kelly, how do you ensure these lean practices don't compromise employee well-being? How does those translate into a factory setting or a shop floor setting?
That's such a great question. And I think about lean from the perspective of, right, there are two main guiding principles. Right, there's the continuous improvement side. So we need to try to make things better every day. And then there's the respect for people side of the equation. And often, right, the tools are focused on the continuous improvement side. And it's fun to implement tools because you implement something and you get that dopamine hit. So it feels good. So you want to keep doing it. However, if you don't also balance that respect for people and humanity side, that's when you can definitely implement and compromise an employee's well-being. So I think the first is just continue to keep in mind that respect for people is also a very large pillar. And realistically, right, we do these things. Yes, ultimately, lean implementation is about growing the business via, right, doing more with less, which means more revenue and growth for the company. But I love Jamie V. Parker says this, organizations are made up of people. Yes, there might be equipment involved in machines, but you need the humans to actually do the work. And it could be do the programming, could be operate the equipment, it could be move part A from point A to B, but it still requires people.
Yeah.
And so keeping that respect for humanity, which doesn't mean that you have to always be nice, right? It means that you have to, with kindness, hold people accountable, with kindness and empathy, set those expectations and standards, um, and create that safe environment for them to bring things up, because that's another really important part of a lean culture, is that people feel safe bringing issues and ideas up, right? We all need to be problem solvers and solution providers to really embody that culture and be able to effectively grow a business using lean practices and principles.
No, that's fantastic. Absolutely. I completely agree. I don't think it's possible to implement a lean or any kind of transformation for that matter if you don't win over hearts and minds of people first. Because at the end of the day,
Right.
it's really all about people. Yeah.
Right. And a good just like easy rule of thumb is any improvement effort, if it's an event or if you're organically like grassroots going out on the floor to make improvement, just keep a rule in mind that you want to make the operators happy. And that's it. Because generally their ideas are going to yield those better results and better growth in time. So if you just keep that principle in mind, my aim is to keep people happy. My aim is to make operators happy, then you'll generally move forward and make the right choices and improve that process for them.
Fantastic. That's really helpful. Uh, what's what has changed in lean manufacturing since COVID-19, Kelly? I've heard you or I've seen you talk about this before. How has lean changed since it was a huge transformational event. I know factories implemented a bunch of changes, but how does it impact lean really?
Yeah, what I've seen, and I can't say for sure if COVID was the catalyst for this, it may have been, but I've seen two major shifts. One, right, we are starting to see this shift from take the tools and implement them to build underlying thinking patterns.
Right.
And so you see the rise of kata as a method of doing that. I hear a lot more about coaching versus just implementation. And I think a lot of that came from learning. Like we would not have known that had we not, as a community, a manufacturing global community, tried to implement these tools. So like what great learning that we've taken from this, and now can go forward. So that's one big one. Seeing a lot more chatter about the tools are great, but how do we take the principles underlying them and the thinking patterns that developed them and implement those instead? Because then we'll be able to build our own tools using those principles and systems that will work inside of our organizations and teams. The second major thing is the rise of virtual work, right? So, including, I've seen a lot more and had to participate in a lot more virtual Kaizen, which is a fascinating animal, right? because most of the time you assume, okay, Kaizen happens on the shop floor. So we go to Gemba, we go look. But in a post-COVID world, that's not where everybody works anymore. So now it's using the digital tools that have been developed through that period. So a lot more AI use, a lot more Zoom. And I love that there was a short period in the organizations that I was working with where it did take a pause, but we came back. And instead of saying, well, now it won't work because we're not as much in a physical environment at work, we adapted our methods, which is so wonderful. So now I've done a virtual Gemba walk where I'll do a Teams call on my phone and walk somebody out on the floor. And it's amazing how we've begun to use AI and these virtual tools to our benefit to engage more in Kaizen and Lean. It's been very cool.
That's a great point. Absolutely. I work in software development myself, and obviously our whole world has completely changed due to virtual work. But that's really fascinating. I appreciate that. So Kelly, what's the toughest resistance that you faced in introducing Lean to these shop floors, and how did you handle that resistance?
Oh, I love this question because to me, some of the hardest groups bear the most fruit from a learning perspective and facilitation. So I worked with a team, maybe 2 years ago, so 2022 timeframe. And this was inside of GE Aerospace. We had the largest tool room out of the division that I supported. And this team had a very firm mindset that, Lean actually causes harm, does not improve business. And there was a lot of stiff arm of, hey, we don't want to go through transformation, right? We don't need this. And so what I did was a lot of hearts and minds, as you mentioned. I spent a lot of time on the floor with them, just getting to know who they were as individuals. What were their concerns? What was going on for them? And that really had a great benefit because I built individual credibility. And I was able to then work with them on what mattered to them. And then, right, it was a lot easier to ask them to try something when they knew me and I knew them. So it wasn't, right, a CI or a lean or an operational excellence person swooping in and saying, well, you're not doing it right, because they were doing their job exactly how they were supposed to be doing it and had been doing it. So nothing was wrong. I just needed to help open their eyes to the fact that it could be better. And the only way to do that was to connect with them personally and connect with their values. And so from that, then they became avid in a few areas. I won't say that they converted wholly, but the focus areas that really mattered to them, that then really mattered to their customers, which was the rest of the factory, they were very open and high supporters of making process improvement.
Kelly, how do you measure success in these kinds of deployments or in these kinds of transformations?
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging thing, because I've witnessed, right, you need to measure something because what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. And then you can't assess how it's going. The risk and the stumbling blocks and pitfalls are what you measure will lead to certain behavior. And so you have to be very thoughtful about what behavior do you want to see. And so I think the good measures of a transformation are the standard business KPIs. Whatever your site is measuring, make sure it's a balanced scorecard of SQDC or SQDIP, right? Whatever the right measures there are. Mm-hmm. And if you are doing the right things from a transformation and lean perspective, it will hit those other measures. And then additionally, what would you see culturally change? So I personally measure thinking patterns in the people that I interact with. And it's not always a perfect analytical measure. Sometimes it is subjective. And as long as I've got a good baseline of what does good look like, then I can assess people from that perspective. But it does get a little fuzzy, and that can be challenging. But I would say I haven't come across like the perfect measure yet. Align your business measures, keep an eye on those, because if you're doing the right thing from a lean perspective, it will hit those. And then what matters to you culturally? Is it that you want psychological safety? Okay, then assess the interactions that you have and look for those characteristics. Is it a culture of scientific thinkers, which is what I'm aiming for? So I look at language, I look at how vague or specific, how data driven, those are the things I'm looking at. And it's a little more subjective. Build your scale to what that behavior looks like and start measuring.
Wow, that's really insightful. Sounds simple, but at the same time, wow. Kelly, how do you integrate sustainability into lean practices? Really, have you thought about that? Have you worked in that?
I've thought about it a little bit, and I'll admit this is also a kind of a new frontier that I'm seeing more of, which is wonderful. And if you consider simplification is really what we're aiming for, right? So every value stream, including a waste stream, how do we improve and simplify that? Let's make it easier. I think that can help integrate sustainability. What I'm very cautious of here is hitting sustainability for the sake of it, right? Just like anything, it's got to be a good balance. But keeping these rules in mind of let's not add, right? Let's not add additional steps. Let's not add additional power sources or requirements or add additional waste streams. Let's only make sure that we maintain or simplify. That can definitely help. And again, like we talked about a few questions ago, keep the people in mind, because we don't want to make people's jobs harder for the sake of sustainability. It's definitely an and, not an or.
Yeah. No, great. That makes a ton of sense. Kelly, could you talk about a failure that turned into a valuable lesson? I always like to ask my guests about failures, not just successes, because that gives us additional insight into how they develop their leadership philosophies and how they lead and uh, consult and provide their recommendations. Can you talk about failures and that have turned into lessons for you?
Absolutely. It's hard to pick one to talk about.
Right.
I agree. I think failures are so helpful. I'll talk about one that happened again a couple of years ago. So while working at GE, we were implementing a model line, and one failure that I had personally as a leader in this transformation was I got sucked into, we just need to go implement this tool. And we were looking at standard work at the time. And so there was pressure externally to do this. And as a leader, I got sucked into that, and I fell to that pressure. And so what happened is we went out and we did the right work of, we're going to go observe the process with the operators. We'll coordinate with them and develop those standards. And so we were prepared and rolling out standard work across this value stream. And there was some pushback and grumbling because we were aiming for the lowest repeating time. And they're like, well, we can't do that because we have all these other problems. But I was pushing to implement and just get this the check the box mindset. And what ended up happening, the team got very defensive and combative, which 100% makes sense given what I was doing to them. And our external coach came in and dressed me down a little bit with respect to this, said, hey, like, you can't just go implement standard work if we don't solve their problems. Like, solve the problems first, and then they will happily follow standard work. And so it was a painful month of work and a months long lesson, but it was so beneficial. And I could not have really learned it in any other way. And the main learnings, a couple of main learnings from that: one, never ever ask an operator to do something until you've made their work better. Right? never implement something without working with them on their own work and making it easier and better first. And then the second, do not let pressure force you out of your own values and principles. Because before then and now, I preach, don't just implement tools, don't do lean to people. And I did it. And so it was a really wonderful experience to, understand what that feels like so that I know how to approach that if I'm leading somebody and asking somebody to implement something. So I have that empathy and understanding. And that also helps me now push back and hold strong on those principles with external and upward leaders so I can coach up and hold that wall and umbrella a little more firmly.
Yeah, makes sense. Kelly, manufacturing is obviously a huge industry, maybe the biggest industry on the planet. But at the same time, unfortunately, especially in leadership, manufacturing leadership, we see an really severe underrepresentation of women. What advice do you have for women aiming for leadership roles in manufacturing?
So some of the biggest advice that I can give is even right. We want to see people. We want to aim for things and roles where we see ourselves in. And like you said, with women being underrepresented in those roles, you can't see another image of yourself because you can't see another woman in that role. And so I would say just because you can't see it, don't believe it can't happen because it can. And I'm very grateful the company I work for right now and with has a lot of leadership that are women. This is the first staff I've been on that I think over 50% of the staff is women, which is phenomenal. So even if the role models aren't there in your organization or your team, they do exist. So just because you can't see it, don't think it can't happen. And the other really important thing is do not change who you are because it is a male-dominated world, right? That's by being your true self and sticking to your values, your performance will shine compared to trying to be something that you're not and that you shouldn't be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kelly, switching gears again, back to some technical topics. You've talked about agile. I was going through some of your posts and I read one really insightful one about how agile and kata complement each other. Could you say a little bit about that? How do agile and kata complement each other in process improvement?
Yeah, I love the merging of those two. And I know Joe Krebs has done a lot of work with working on kata inside of an agile environment. And I think we're learning that they can play really nicely together. Right. So both agile and kata are really all about short-term sprinting. So in agile, it is called a sprint, generally 2 weeks, where a team is focused on a specific body of work and achieving that body of work in a timeline. In kata, it's called a target condition. And it's generally a week or 2 weeks. And it's a similar thing where a learner is focusing on a specific process and aiming to achieve certain improvement in that timeline. So both work through these principles of taking larger projects or larger challenges and breaking them down into these bite-sized elements. And then at the end of that sprint or target condition, you pause and reflect on how did it go, what changes need to be made going forward. So both of these have a similar pattern from that end. And additionally, they both have similar patterns in mastery, where you can practice, right? You need to practice with specific patterns initially, like with training wheels. But then once you are ready, the worst thing you can do is keep the training wheels on. And so both bodies allow for, I think it's called shuhari, and it's right. How do you become? You're a beginner learner. You stick to the patterns very effectively. You stick very tightly to your training wheels. Once you're comfortable, though, you need to move into a little bit of exploration and push the boundaries, start to experiment with the formats and structures. And then only through that can you become a master and adapt those principles. to whatever you need to be working on and whatever processes and elements your organization is working through. And so honestly, I really do think about they're like near cousins. They're so similar in their use. It's just maybe we talk about things a little bit differently. The wording's a little bit different. But I really do see they're so similar that it's very obvious as well that they could merge across. And it might be, hey, during my target condition, I'm going to use some agile principles, or hey, during the sprint, we're going to use some kata principles. They are so similar that they can play really well together.
Fantastic. Kelly, you already mentioned, briefly mentioned AI and virtual, being able to do Gemba walks virtually. Any, do you want to point out any tools or any other things that you've seen, anything noticeable that you've seen within within your kata implementations or within Lean that based on we've all heard about chat gpt and those kinds of tools and technologies. Are you maybe using that? Are there other tools, new tools that you've seen used in lean transformations?
Yeah, I have seen a lot more use of AI, which is really wonderful, especially for that transactional work or that hidden body of work where it's not as obvious and it's harder to think about how to improve that. And right, it's in a manufacturing environment where we make widgets, it's very easy to see how could I take the work of building this widget from a human to a robot or to a piece of equipment. But it's been much harder to see how do I make this hidden body of work easier. But now with AI, it's becoming a lot more available. And no longer, I think, do we have to think about, oh, well, I don't have expertise in that. I've got to go hire that out. The availability of that knowledge is much more at everybody's fingertips. So it's really just about being thoughtful with the use. And, I'll admit I could do more with my own processes in using AI to help supplement the work that I do. And I think that it's only going to help us make work easier and better for people as long as we keep that in mind, that it's got to be better for the person. And that's right. Maintaining the same principles and thinking, I think, will be really important. But gosh, I'm excited for the next 10 years to see what this unlocks for us as a community and a global environment.
Fantastic. Kelly, here's my last one, a question that I ask all of my guests as well. What is the one thing that manufacturers aren't doing enough of to be factory forward in 2024? Any thoughts there?
I love this question, and it's so hard. This was, it's so thought-provoking too. I think the one thing that manufacturers don't do enough of is be very thoughtful and reflective of our own thinking. For example, right, we all have voices that tell us things. We have intuition, we have knowledge and experience, and some of it very valuable, a lot of it very valuable, some of it not necessarily valuable in every moment. And I think we are thinking and feeling beings, and the only way that we lead is by being better in tuned with our own understandings, our own biases, our own thoughts. And so I think, right, these new technologies and new ways of working, these shiny new external things, I think we're at a risk of focusing too much on that and forgetting the impact that our internal monologue and dialogue has on how we show up as a leader, or even just as an individual who works in a team. And so I think that's something to watch out for as we get into this new age of AI and technology, that right, our thinking and biases also influence how those tools work for us. So I think that's something that let's all be aware of, right? What is that inner dialogue saying to you, and is it really true? Because a lot of the times our brains will make up stories to fill in information gaps, which is a phenomenal tool that we have as humans, but it can also bite us if we're not very cautious about it.
I love that. Again, seemingly simple, but really, really deep. I appreciate it. Thank you, Kelly. It's been great having you and talking to you. Really, really appreciate it. Uh, you know, uh, Thank you so much. We would love to have you again on the show, and thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And that's a wrap on this powerhouse episode of Factory Forward. If you loved this episode, share it with your network and keep the conversation going on social media using #FactoryForward. Until next time, keep challenging the status quo and striving for excellence. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode of Factory Forward.